Egypt is in a tough spot. Almost the entire country squeezed tightly along the Nile, while the other 96% of its land is nothing but desert. But there may be a way to change that. Every year, an enormous amount of Nile water simply flows into the Mediterranean without being meaningfully stored or used within Egypt. And that leads to a bold idea. What if the Nile could be stopped? Yes, literally blocked off at several points along its course. That could create several massive reservoirs, maybe even an inland sea. The desert could begin to bloom, dramatically reshaping one of Egypt's biggest challenges. But how could something like that actually be done? And what would the consequences be? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. In 1950, Egypt's population was 20 million. Back then, that number of people could still live reasonably well along the Nile. But after that, things began to spiral. By 2010, the population had already reached 82 million. And all of those people also needed to live near the Nile simply because there was nowhere else to go. The pressure was real, and the country's main river was supporting people almost to its limit. But that was 16 years ago. What about now? In 2026, Egypt's population reached a staggering 120 million. The overwhelming majority still live along the Nile. And at this point, it's fair to call the situation a real catastrophe. In some areas, population density reaches 80,000 people per 0.4 square miles. It sounds like a mistake, but it's not. In parts of Greater Cairo and Giza, there's so many people that there's barely room to stand without bumping into someone. At first glance, that might sound like a familiar story in today's world, but population density on this scale has real consequences. Even a normal commute turns into a nightmare because of traffic. And somewhere inside that endless congestion, billions of dollars disappear. Traffic jams cost the country about $8 billion a year. That's roughly 4% of its GDP. Quite a steep fee just for trying to get somewhere, but the roads aren't even the worst part because Egypt is also running out of space to live. The land situation in Egypt has been at the breaking point for a long time. Nearly everything that could be used for construction has already been taken. What remains is either difficult to build on or not appealing, so the city begins to expand wherever it can. That's how the City of the Dead came to be. And no, that's not a metaphor. These are actual cemeteries where people live among the tombs. They move into mausoleums, settle into the spaces between graves, run electricity, and open small shops. Some make tea, some repair shoes, and some simply live ordinary lives there. Strange? Quite so. But when there are no other options, people settle anywhere there's room, even in a cemetery. And just when it seems things can't get any worse, another problem appears: food. Where do you grow it when the population has increased sixfold in 70 years? The land along the Nile is not infinite. Every foot is already claimed, divided, and used. The situation doesn't look good. The country can't produce enough food for itself. That leaves only one option: imports. Purchases, contracts, supply deals. In other words, dependence on what happens beyond Egypt's borders. And this is where the story becomes especially interesting because the world today is unstable. Everything works one day, and the next day the chain breaks. That's exactly what happened in 2022. Supplies from the Black Sea region fell, and the prices of bread and flour began to rise. The government, of course, stepped in, tried to hold prices down, and increase subsidies. But in the end, money started flowing out faster than anyone wanted, and the budget began to look like a bucket full of holes. It still held water, but it kept leaking at the same time. Every new grain purchase now costs more than the one before it. The food situation's made even worse by the fact that Egyptians simply want to build homes for themselves, so they build them. Not just anywhere, but right on fertile farmland. They take concrete and red brick, the same red brick seen in so many photos from Egypt, and start putting up houses. No special permits, no long approval process. They just build because they have to. In 2011 alone, around 2 million cases of illegal construction on agricultural land were recorded. The authorities are trying to slow the process down. They ban it, monitor it, and in some places demolish what has been built, but the construction doesn't stop. It just finds other ways around the rules. So people keep trying. They build, they adapt, they carve out more space for housing and farming. But why did they think it could actually work? Because Egypt had already made it work before. Let's look at the map. In 1971, the Aswan High Dam appeared right here. It was built right on the Nile, the river at the center of this entire story. The structure is massive, to say the least, nearly 2.5 miles long and more than 330 feet high. But its importance goes far beyond its scale. It's what the dam actually made possible. Once construction was finished, the water level began to rise and Lake Nasser was formed. It's an enormous reservoir, so large that it's still counted among the biggest man-made lakes in the world. Egypt now has steady, controlled irrigation. Farmers could plant in winter, grow crops in summer. In the end, many were able to produce 2 harvests a year. But even that was only the beginning. Once you have that much stored water, a bold idea naturally follows. What if you do more than improve the old farmland? What if you create entirely new land? That's exactly what happened. Thanks to the new reservoir, engineers quite literally reclaimed more than 1.2 million acres from the desert. Places that had once been nothing but sand and wind were turned into plantations, orchards, and productive farmland. And one of the projects that grew out of this still captures people's imagination to this day. So let's go back to the map. Does anything about this spot catch your eye? It's all desert and sand, and then suddenly perfectly green circles. This is the Tashka project. It was Egypt's way of testing whether it could negotiate with the desert. And spoiler, in some ways it worked. Technically, the project is on a massive scale. Water's taken straight from Lake Nasser and pumped through the giant Mubarak pumping station. The scale sounds almost unreal, up to 6.6 billion gallons of water a day. From there, the water flows into the Sheikh Zayed Canal, which stretches for about 31 miles. Just imagine that line cutting through the sand. Now back to those circles. They're not there for decoration, they are center pivot irrigation systems. Massive structures rotate around a central point and water the land evenly. From above, it's actually mesmerizing. The machinery moves slowly and life appears underneath it. And all of this is happening in a place where rain is rare. So far, the Tashka project has already brought more than 247,000 acres of land into use, and that's not even the limit, because the plan is to reclaim more than 618,000 acres from the desert. They're already growing wheat and corn there, and there are also huge plantations of premium date palms. So this is no longer just whatever managed to grow, it's high-quality produce. That means Egypt already knows how to build systems like this and make the desert yield. So in theory, it could do even more with the Nile to transform dry land. But what exactly would Egypt need to do? To truly reshape the country's geography, Egypt would have to take some pretty radical steps. The Nile can't just be adjusted a little, it would have to be stopped in places where that's even possible. That means areas where the plateau almost hangs over the water, or places where the banks become hard and rocky, as if they were made for this kind of intervention. That's where dams would have to go, real concrete giants that don't rely on clever mechanisms, but on sheer mass. They simply stand there and stop the water from flowing the way it used to. The pressure is enormous. Millions of tons of water press against the wall, and the wall holds. But the point isn't just to block the river. The idea is more interesting than that. A dam raises the water level, sometimes by dozens of feet. As a result, deep reservoirs appear, almost like inland seas. They sit above the old valley, practically hanging over it. If the river once ran as a narrow strip squeezed between its banks, then with dams it would become a broad body of water pushing gradually into the desert. That's where a dam megaproject would start working for people. Moisture becomes available where there used to be only dry, lifeless ground. The water stays stable. It doesn't just vanish or disappear. On the map, instead of a thin line, you get something far more massive. Huge mirrors of water that literally expand the zone of life. For a country with such a large population, that sounds like a real opportunity because it creates new living space. New shorelines appear, and their total length is many times greater than the old course of the Nile. Along those shores, you can build, plant, and develop almost anything. Cities would start spreading outward. Fields would too. People would finally have the option of moving farther away from the old valley, where overcrowding is already extreme and concrete has long since pushed everything else aside. But reservoirs alone are not enough. It's not enough to store water. You have to deliver it to places that were once empty. That's where canals come in. They would have to run from the Nile and from new reservoirs deep into the desert, straight across the sand, sometimes for dozens of miles. The good news is that this isn't science fiction. This technology has been used for decades. Wide main canals lined with stone or concrete slabs already exist in many countries. It's all practical and logical. The water has to go where it's meant to go, not seep away into the sand along the way. Otherwise, the whole project quickly turns into a pointless waste of resources. And the effect can show up fairly quickly. Once a canal passes through, moisture appears and the land starts to work. Entire farming zones can emerge right in the middle of the sands. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. Then the logic becomes simple. More usable land means more domestic harvests. Wheat, for example, which Egypt currently imports at high cost, could be grown inside the country. But that raises another question. How can the country be sure that these new green areas will not just end up swallowed by housing development? The answer is that if there's a whole network of dams and canals, there should be enough newly greened land both to set aside areas for new housing and to expand agricultural land. Why build over fertile land if there's already room for people elsewhere? Okay, but there's a catch. Look here. Say a dam and a reservoir are built in one place, but the canal needs to reach land over there. Water's not going to flow uphill on its own. Physics is still a factor. So what do? You build pumping stations, a lot of them, a whole lot, which leads to the next question. Where does the energy for all of this infrastructure come from? Because it would take a huge amount, to put it mildly. The answer is almost right underfoot. Egypt is one of the sunniest places on Earth. The sun there works non-stop. You could install solar panel canopies directly over the canals. You put structures above the water with solar panels mounted on them, long rows of photovoltaic modules on metal supports. So instead of just a canal, you get a canal power plant stretching for miles. Sounds a little futuristic? Well, it's already a very real idea. Systems like this are being tested in California's San Joaquin Valley, and the results were pretty clear pretty quickly. The combination is almost perfect. The panels generate electricity for the pumps, while the water below provides natural cooling. The solar cells overheat less and produce a few percent more power. On a national scale, that's not a small gain. But why put panels over canals in the first place? After all, there's plenty of empty land around them. It all comes down to evaporation. In open canals under blazing sun, water disappears fast. The losses are enormous. Panels above the canal act like a giant shade structure. They lower the temperature and evaporation drops sharply, in some cases by 80 to 90%. Now let's look at the map. Egypt may actually have a chance to create its own inland sea in the Sahara by diverting water from one of its dams through canals all the way over here and forming a massive reservoir. But how would that even work? This place on the map is the Qattara Depression, a huge natural basin covering about 7,500 square miles. That's roughly the size of a whole country like Slovenia or Israel. And its floor lies about 436 feet below sea level. At first glance, it seems almost perfect for creating a giant body of water. The idea of filling this basin with water has been around for more than a century. Back in the early 20th century, engineers were already asking, what if a sea could be created here? Since then, the idea has resurfaced again and again. People ran the numbers, debated it, and drew up plans. But it never moved beyond paper. Now, with a new system of dams and reservoirs, that old dream may finally have a real foundation. Using one of the new dams as a starting point, Egypt could potentially send a major flow of water through a main canal straight toward the depression. The only thing left would be to start filling it, and the surrounding territory could begin to transform. If that sea ever appears, everything around it would begin to revolve around its shores. Thousands of miles of new waterfront could open the door to large-scale agriculture. Some crops could be moved here, easing the pressure on the Nile Valley, which is already overcrowded and overstretched. And people would follow the water. New cities could appear with proper urban planning, nearby jobs and opportunities in agriculture, logistics, and fishing. It could become a real alternative to Cairo, where population density is already overwhelming. Life next to a vast body of water sounds far more attractive. But that raises the obvious question, if this sounds so promising, why has it still never happened? The biggest obstacle is the relentless desert sun. Water from this new reservoir would constantly evaporate, while the salt would remain behind. At some point, instead of a useful inland sea, you could end up with an extremely salty body of water that's close to useless. Is there any way around that? One option would be to cover parts of the surface with floating solar farms. That would be expensive, but they could provide both shade and energy. There's also a simpler idea. Just keep adding water and ignore the evaporation losses. That sounds questionable. But there's another piece to the puzzle here: desalination. Even if the water becomes too salty, it could still be desalinated and used for irrigation. Yes, that would mean even more spending, but at the scale of a project like this, those costs no longer seem completely unthinkable. So does that mean transforming Egypt is actually possible, and the only real problem is the price tag? Not exactly. It's much more complicated. This mega project to green the desert could end up not as Egypt's salvation, but as its destruction. Let me explain. A dam is not just a structure that holds back water and creates a reservoir. One of its most important effects is that it traps silt and all the other sediments that would normally keep moving downstream, and by this point, people have already almost completely cut the Nile off from that flow. Before the Aswan Dam was built, the Nile carried an average of about 134 million tons of sand, silt, and clay every year. Roughly 100 million tons of that made it all the way to the Delta and the Mediterranean. Then the dam was built, and now only a fraction reaches the end of the river. Almost all of it settles in Lake Nasser instead. Now imagine what happens if even one more barrier appears on the river in the form of another dam. The result is simple. Virtually none of that sediment will make it to the river's end, and that puts the entire Nile Delta at risk, that huge green stretch of Egyptian land. That same river debris, which people usually think of as useless waste, is actually the foundation of the whole delta, quite literally. Those sediments kept it alive for thousands of years. The sea keeps pushing in, eroding the coast and wearing the delta away. The river used to answer by bringing fresh layers of sediment and building land back up. That was how the balance worked. Once that flow weakened, the balance was disrupted and the Mediterranean started taking over. Without that yearly replenishment, the shoreline begins to disappear. In some places, it's retreating by dozens of yards a year. The old sand gets washed away and no new sand replaces it. It's now trapped behind dams upstream. And the truth is, Egypt isn't the only country affecting the sediment flow. There's another country that's been doing this very aggressively in recent years: Ethiopia. This is about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. It's a massive structure on the Blue Nile. And the Blue Nile, by the way, provides more than 80% of the water that eventually reaches the main Nile channel. Construction began back in 2011, and today it's the most powerful hydroelectric plant in Africa. It's essentially a 476-foot wall. Behind it's a reservoir so vast it can hold a volume of water comparable to the Nile's entire annual flow. For Ethiopia, this is not just infrastructure, it's a symbol, a chance to break out of chronic energy shortages and in many ways step into a completely new stage. The plant generates more than 5 gigawatts of power. That means electricity for tens of millions of people who used to live with blackouts or had no power at all. It also means energy exports to neighboring countries and a foundation for factories, cities, and economic growth. The country starts playing on a completely different level. But there's another side to this story, and it affects the whole river. In the past, the Blue Nile carried not only water downstream, but also enormous amounts of silt, fertile, mineral-rich silt, one that fed the lands below for centuries. Now that flow runs into the reservoir. The water slows down, the silt settles to the bottom, and it stays there. What continues downstream is clean water, clear, but poor in nutrients, stripped of that natural fertilizer. Which begs the question, isn't the Nile being pushed too far? Egypt's already using it heavily, so is there really enough water left for another massive desert greening project? Well, the situation's not very encouraging. On paper, Egypt is entitled to 14.6 trillion gallons of water a year under the 1959 agreement. But in reality, the country's current needs are closer to 21 to 24 trillion gallons of water. The gap is obvious. The country's already living with a serious water deficit. By UN standards, anything below 264,000 gallons of water per person per year counts as water scarcity. Below 132,000 gallons is considered an extreme level, close to outright water poverty. Egypt has already fallen below 145,000 gallons per person, and the number is still dropping. So the obvious question is, where does the water for all these new projects even come from? The answer is ingenuity. Egypt has essentially learned how to use the same water more than once. First, it goes to cities and farmland in the delta, then it's collected through drainage systems, treated, and sent onward into the desert. And the scale is impressive. One example is the giant Bahr el Bakar water treatment plant, which was even recognized by Guinness World Records. It processes about 1.5 billion gallons of water per day. That water is then reused for newly reclaimed land, including parts of Sinai. There are also other facilities like the Al Masama water treatment plant, which adds roughly another 264 million gallons a day. The result is a kind of closed-loop system. The water keeps circulating, taking on different roles instead of being lost. Even so, it's still not enough, which is why desalination is also becoming part of the strategy. The logic is simple. Supply cities with desalinated seawater and free up Nile water for agriculture. Egypt already has more than 80 such plants, and its plans are ambitious. By 2050, the country aims to reach nearly 2.3 billion gallons of desalinated water per day. And there's one more source, groundwater. Beneath the sands lies what scientists sometimes call Egypt's strategic reserve, the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System. It's the largest known reservoir of fossil freshwater in the world, stretching beneath 4 countries. For Egypt, it's almost like a prehistoric ocean sealed underground thousands of years ago, back when the Sahara was still a green savanna. But this underground miracle comes with a price and an expiration date. Unlike rivers which are replenished by rainfall, these reserves don't recover. Once the water level drops too far, pumping it makes zero economic sense. Egyptian engineers understand that this is a race against time, which is why groundwater use is tightly regulated and combined with precision drip irrigation. The goal is simple: to squeeze the maximum possible harvest out of every drop of fossil water while the country tries to rebuild its water system around desalination and large-scale water recycling. And once you look at all of that, the situation becomes pretty clear. Egypt is trying to manage its water shortage by every means available. Yes, a new mega-project could help resettle people and increase domestic food production, but right now the country simply isn't in a position to carry out something on that scale. Maybe that becomes possible later, when a much larger share of agriculture can rely on water sources other than the Nile. For now, though, Egypt is working within very hard limits.